The door hit Mae Brenner so hard on her way out that the brass handle left a bruise on her palm, and she stood in the middle of Caldwell, Kansas on a Tuesday in April of 1882, with every single thing she owned stuffed into a flour sack, and not one person in this town willing to look her in the eye. She had been inside that building for 11 minutes. 11 minutes to hear Judge Harlan Cass tell her that the deed to her father's land, the deed she had ridden 40 miles through a dust storm to retrieve, the deed her father had signed with his own hand before the fever took him, was null, void, and unenforceable, because her father had borrowed money from Silas Greer 3 years ago, and Silas Greer now owned every acre of the Brenner plot, including the house where Mae had been born, including the well her father had dug by hand, including the old oak tree at the property's edge where her mother was buried. She had not cried in front of the judge. She had not cried in front of Silas Greer's lawyer, a slick man named Dobbins who smelled of bay rum and contempt. She had not cried when the bailiff walked her to the door with a hand on her elbow like she was a problem to be removed. But she was crying now, standing in the April wind with grit in her teeth and a bruise on her palm because every door had closed, every single one. She had tried the bank first, 6 weeks ago. Theodore Marsh, the bank manager, had listened to her with his hands folded and his eyes on the window behind her head, and he had said that without collateral, without a husband's signature, without anything to secure a loan, there was nothing he could do. He had said it gently, which had almost been worse than if he had said it cruelly. She had tried her father's oldest friend, Walt Prout, who ran the feed store on the southern end of town. Walt had given her a meal and a night's sleep on his floor, and then told her, quietly, apologetically, that he had his own debts and his own family, and he could not afford to take on anyone else's trouble. He had pressed $2 into her hand when she left, and those $2 were still in her pocket, and they were all she had. She had tried the church. Reverend Aldous had told her that the Lord provided for those who showed patience. She had walked out of the church before she said something she would not be able to take back. She had tried 3 ranches north of town, asking for work. 2 of them had turned her away before she finished speaking. The third, run by a man named Copley, had offered her work of a kind she refused, and she had left that property at a run. And now the courthouse had taken the last thing, not just her land, but the legal fiction that the land had ever truly been hers to fight for. Silas Greer had won before she even understood the game was being played. She wiped her face with the back of her hand and looked at the street. Caldwell in the spring was a busy, brutal place. Cattle drives came through, drovers came through, gamblers and merchants and men looking for work and men running from work they had already done badly. The street was loud with horses and boots and the smell of livestock. Nobody looked at her. Nobody had any particular reason to. She thought about what came next and found nothing clear. She had no family left that she knew of. Her mother had died when Mae was 12. Her father's brother had gone to California in 1871 and sent 1 letter and then silence. She was 24 years old and she had been raised on that land, that 40-acre plot her father had loved with a devotion bordering on religion. And the land was gone and her father was gone, and she was standing in a wind that smelled like cattle and dust, and she genuinely did not know which direction to walk. It was the woman at the dry goods counter who changed things. Her name was Bertha Hollies, and she had known Mae's father years ago, before everything fell apart, and when Mae came in out of the wind to stand still for a moment and collect herself, Bertha looked at her with something that was not quite pity and not quite sympathy, but something in between that held more dignity than either. "You look like you've been run through a ringer," Bertha said. "I feel like it," Mae said. Bertha studied her for a moment, then reached under the counter and produced a folded piece of paper. "Fellow came through 2 weeks ago. Left these posted all over, looking for a housekeeper. Ranch about 22 miles east, out past Shiloh Creek. Stone Ranch." She paused. "Ira Stone, you know the name?" Mae shook her head. "I don't know much about him either," Bertha said. He's been out here about 4 years, keeps to himself. Bought that land from old Mercer when Mercer's wife got sick and they went back east. Runs cattle, some horses. People who have dealt with him say he's fair. She slid the paper across the counter. He's paying $4 a month plus room and board. It's not much, but it's a roof. Mae looked at the paper. The handwriting was plain and careful. The letters formed with the deliberate precision of someone who had not written easily as a child and had worked at it until it became clean. The notice asked for someone capable of cooking, cleaning, and general household management. It said the work was honest and the pay was regular. It said to present yourself at Stone Ranch on any morning before noon. She folded the paper and put it in her pocket with the $2. "Thank you," she said to Bertha. "Your father was a good man," Bertha said. "What Greer did to him was rotten. What Greer's doing to you is rotten. I'm sorry the law won't see it." Mae nodded because words felt dangerous right then. Like if she opened her mouth too wide, something irreparable would come out of it. She slept that night in the livery, with the permission of the stable hand who took her $2 for the privilege. And she lay in the straw and stared at the dark ceiling and thought about her father, and thought about the oak tree over her mother's grave, and thought about Silas Greer's satisfied expression in the courtroom when the judge read his ruling. And she made herself breathe slowly and think about the folded piece of paper in her pocket and the handwriting that looked like something carefully built. In the morning, she borrowed a horse from a drover who was going east anyway and needed someone to help manage a second animal, and she rode the 22 miles to Shiloh Creek with the sun coming up behind her and the prairie spreading out in all directions like something that didn't care about her at all, which she found oddly comforting. The prairie didn't hate her. It was simply indifferent, and indifference was better than the active hostility she'd been receiving. She smelled the ranch before she saw it. Good wood smoke, and something cooking, and horses, and green grass where water was close enough to the surface to keep things alive. Then she came over a low rise and saw it laid out below her. A solid house, not large but well built, with a covered porch on the south side. A barn painted red that was clearly newer than the house. 2 smaller outbuildings. A corral with 4 horses in it. And beyond all of that, rolling grassland with cattle spread across it in the easy, unconcerned way of cattle that are well fed and well managed. A man was splitting wood beside the house. She could see him from the rise, the clean arc of the axe, the wood splitting with authority, the pile beside him growing with each swing. He was not a small man. He was broad across the shoulders in a way that looked structural rather than showy, the kind of body built by actual work rather than any vanity about it. He wore a plain blue shirt, canvas trousers, and boots that had seen considerable use. His hat was pushed back on his head in a way that meant he was working in his own yard and not performing anything for anyone. She rode down. He heard the horse and turned before she reached the yard, one hand resting on the axe handle with a naturalness that was not quite readiness but not quite ease either. The posture of a man who had learned to register what came toward him before deciding what it was. When she got close enough for him to see her face, something in his posture shifted toward something more neutral. He took his hat off and held it. "Morning," he said. "Morning," she said. "I'm looking for Ira Stone." "You found him." She was close enough now to see his face properly, and she registered it with the quick, economical assessment of someone who had learned to read people fast because slow reading had costs she couldn't afford. He was somewhere in his early 30s, she guessed. Dark hair, already developing the kind of weathered lines around the eyes that the Kansas sun gave to everyone who worked outside. But on him, the lines looked like something written rather than something inflicted. His eyes were a dark, steady brown, and they were looking at her with a directness that was evaluating without being invasive the look of someone who needed accurate information and was trying to get it without being unkind. "Mae Brenner," she said. "I saw your notice at the dry goods store in Caldwell about the housekeeper position." He nodded slowly. "You rode out from Caldwell this morning?" "Yes." He looked at her flour sack, at the horse that clearly wasn't hers, at the dust on her coat, and the fact that her eyes were slightly swollen in a way that spoke of recent and significant crying, even if the crying itself was long done. He didn't comment on any of it directly. "Have you eaten?" he said. "I managed," she said, which was not exactly true. He put his hat back on. "Come inside. I'll make coffee. We can talk about the position." She climbed down from the horse, tied it to the post by the porch, and followed him through the door he held open. The inside of the house was clean in the way that a man living alone might manage if he was fundamentally organized and disciplined, but had no particular attachment to anything decorative. There was a cast iron stove that was clearly well maintained, a heavy wooden table with 4 chairs, shelves with provisions arranged with care, a rifle on the wall on its pegs, and almost nothing else of a personal nature except a single framed photograph on a shelf near the window, too far away for me to see clearly, and a collection of books, more books than she had expected, stacked on a low shelf near the chair by the stove. He made coffee without fuss, and he put bread and cold salt pork on the table, and he sat across from her while she ate, which she did without pretending she wasn't hungry, because pretending seemed like a waste of energy. "What's your situation?" he said. She looked at him. "Does that matter for the position?" "It tells me what kind of person I'm dealing with," he said. "And I'd rather know the truth of someone's situation than fill in the gaps with guessing. Guessing tends to go wrong." She drank her coffee and looked at the table, and then decided that she was too tired for anything other than the truth. "My father died 8 weeks ago. He had borrowed money from a man named Silas Greer. I didn't know the extent of the debt. I went back to work the land myself after he died, and Greer came with a lawyer and a sheriff's deputy and told me the land was his. I went to the bank, to the church, to everyone I could think of, and nobody could or would help me. I went to the courthouse yesterday, and the judge confirmed that Greer owns the land. So I have $2 in a flour sack, and I need honest work." She stopped talking and looked at him and waited to see what he would do with that. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I'm sorry about your father. Thank you. Is the situation with Greer resolved, legally speaking? Or is there something ongoing that might bring trouble to your door?" She shook her head. "The judge made his ruling. There's nothing left to contest. Greer has what he wanted. I'm of no further interest to him." Ira Stone nodded. "The position pays $4 a month, room and board included, your own room at the back of the house. The work is cooking, keeping the house, managing the kitchen, stores, laundry. I have 2 ranch hands who work the cattle. You'd have no obligation to manage them, except occasionally feeding them when they're working close to the house. The days are long in summer. I'm not easy company all the time, but I'm fair and I don't make promises I can't keep." He paused. "I can give you the position if you want it." Mae looked at him. "Just like that? What were you expecting?" "Most people have more questions," she said, "or more conditions." "I have one condition," he said. "I won't tolerate dishonesty about anything. If something's wrong, I need to hear it plainly. If you make a mistake, tell me plainly. If you need something, tell me plainly. I'll extend you the same." He held her gaze. "Can you work with that?" "Yes," she said, and she meant it in a way that went deeper than just this arrangement. She was so exhausted by the evasions and the polite cruelties and the sideways ways that people had of saying no without ever saying it directly that plain dealing felt like water when she had been thirsty for weeks. "Good," he said. "Then we have an arrangement." He showed her the room at the back of the house. It was small and narrow, bed with a good wool blanket, a washstand with a basin and pitcher, one window that looked east toward the open prairie, and a hook on the wall for clothing. It was the most private space Mae had occupied in weeks. She set her flour sack down and sat on the edge of the bed and pressed her hands together in her lap and breathed. Outside, she heard the axe resume, the steady crack of it, clean and regular, going on with its work. She got up and went to find out where things were kept and what needed doing, because that was all she had now, and she was going to do it well. The first weeks were a careful navigation of proximity and silence. Mae learned the rhythms of the Stone Ranch the way she had once learned the rhythms of her father's land, by paying attention, by moving carefully, by understanding that every place has a language and you have to listen before you speak. Ira Stone was up before dawn every morning without exception. By the time Mae had the stove going and coffee made, he had already done the first round of the horses and was often coming back in with mud on his boots and his hat damp from the early air. He drank his coffee standing at the kitchen window most mornings, looking out at the land with an expression that was hard to read, not exactly contentment, not exactly unease, something in between that Mae recognized without being able to name it. The look of someone who is where they chose to be and is still working out whether the choice was correct. His two ranch hands were named Clem and Desmond. Clem was 53, small and leathery, and had worked cattle since he was a teenager and had opinions about almost everything and shared them freely but without malice. Desmond was 26, a quiet man who had come up from Texas 3 years ago and who sent money home to his mother every month, and who was unfailingly polite to me in a careful way that told her he had been raised well. They both accepted her presence at the ranch without any particular drama, which she was grateful for. The work itself she knew how to do. Her father had not been a man who believed that certain work belonged to certain people based on their sex. They had been just the two of them on that 40 acres for 12 years after her mother died, and Mae had cooked and cleaned and also mended fence and helped with planting and done whatever needed doing. She knew how to manage a kitchen with limited supplies. She knew how to make bread that didn't shame anyone. She knew how to preserve things, how to stretch provisions, how to keep a stove working when the flue was dirty. What she did not know was Ira Stone, and she found herself paying more attention to him than was strictly necessary for the performance of her duties. He was not a talkative man. In the mornings there was very little conversation. In the evenings, when the work was done and Clem and Desmond had gone to the bunkhouse and the house was quiet, he would sometimes sit with one of those books and Mae would sometimes sit with her mending, and they would exist in the same room without speaking for long periods, and she found, to her surprise, that it was not uncomfortable. She was used to silence as something imposed, as something that meant she was being ignored or dismissed. His silence felt different, chosen, peaceful, present. He was not ignoring her. He was simply not talking, and there was a distinction. He spoke when he had something to say. That was the rule he seemed to operate by. And when he spoke, it was worth attending to because he chose his words the way he split wood with deliberate, accurate aim. One evening in the third week, she was washing the supper dishes and he was at the table cleaning his rifle, and he said, without looking up, "You do that differently." "Do what differently?" "Manage the kitchen. You're more efficient than I expected." She looked at him. "Were you expecting me to be inefficient?" "I had no particular expectations," he said. "I'm commenting on what I've observed. You run things well, less waste than before." "Before?" "I managed the house myself for 2 years after I bought the place. I'm adequate at it but not gifted." He ran an oiled cloth along the rifle barrel with the careful attention he brought to every task. "You're gifted at it. I notice things like that." Mae turned back to the dishes. "My father didn't distinguish between what women should do and what men should do. He just taught me whatever needed teaching. I learned to cook because someone had to, but I also learned to stretch a hide and read a weather map." "Sounds like a practical man," Ira said. "He was," she said, "the most practical man I've ever known, and the most stubborn." It took me years to understand that those were the same quality. Ira made a small sound that was not quite a laugh but was in that direction. She filed that sound away without being entirely sure why. She wrote down everything she noticed about him the way she might have kept accounts, not literally, not on paper, but in the ordered mental ledger she had developed for making sense of the world. He was scrupulously fair with Clem and Desmond, neither friendly in an inappropriate way nor distant in a cold one. He drove himself harder than he drove either of them, and seemed genuinely unbothered by this. He never drank more than 1 glass of whiskey, and only had that on evenings when something had gone particularly badly or particularly well. He had opinions about horses that bordered on philosophical. He had a recurring tension in his left shoulder that he was trying not to show and not quite succeeding. She also noticed the photograph on the shelf. After 3 weeks, she was close enough to see it properly. It was a formal photograph. A man and a woman seated, the kind of portrait made in a studio. The man was younger than Ira was now, but recognizable. The woman was pretty in a round-faced, direct-looking way. They were not touching, which was common for photographs of that era, but there was something in the angle of their bodies that suggested closeness. She didn't ask. It was not her business, and she had not yet earned the currency of personal inquiry with him. But she noticed. The answer came 5 weeks in, on a rainy evening in late May when the prairie was making the sounds it made in real rain, the particular percussion of water on long grass, the low satisfaction of thirsty ground drinking. They were both at the table. He was doing accounts, or trying to. She was making a list of what the kitchen stores needed. The rain was loud enough on the roof to make the interior feel enclosed and somehow easier, like the weather was granting them a certain exemption from ordinary caution. "Was that your wife?" she said. She hadn't planned to say it. It came out. He looked up from his accounts. His expression didn't change in the way that betrayed surprise, but there was a brief stillness in it that told her the question had reached something real. He looked at the photograph and then back at his papers. "Yes," he said. "Her name was Catherine. She died in 1879. Fever in the winter, it moved fast." "I'm sorry," Mae said. She meant it the way she had meant his same words to her, not as a social formula but as an actual acknowledgement of loss. He nodded. "I moved out here in 1880, after." "From where?" "Missouri. Grew up there. My family is there." A pause. "I needed somewhere that didn't have her in it. Every street I walked in Missouri had her in it, every doorway." He said this without apparent self-pity, as a matter of fact. Out here there was nothing of hers. That was the point. Mae looked at the rain on the window. "Did it work? Does it still help being somewhere she wasn't?" He was quiet for a moment, and she thought she had gone too far, and then he said, "It helped for a while. Then I just had a place where she'd never been instead of a place full of her. I'm not sure which is harder." He picked up his pen and returned to his accounts. "But the ranch is good work. Good work helps." "Yes," Mae said. "It does." She turned back to her list, and the rain kept on, and neither of them said anything more, but something had shifted in the room, not dramatically, not in any way that could be pointed to or named, but it was there. Something had moved, like ice beginning to soften at its edges in early spring, and she was aware of it in a way she was not sure she wanted to be, and she was aware of it anyway. June came in with heat that was not gradual but sudden, as though the prairie had been holding it back and then lost patience. Mae adapted to the heat the way she adapted to everything, practically, efficiently, getting the baking and the heaviest cooking done before 8 in the morning, keeping the water barrel full, keeping her hair up off her neck, finding ways to keep the house from holding the heat any more than it had to. Ira brought her a length of blue cotton from Caldwell on a supply run without making any particular announcement about it. He put it on the table when he came back and said, "It occurred to me that you might need fabric, for practical purposes." He said practical as if it were important to establish that this was not anything other than practical. She thanked him with the same careful tone and made herself a summer dress, and did not think about the fact that it was blue, the color of the sky over the ranch in the early morning, which was a specific and particular blue she had begun to find beautiful without meaning to. He saw her in the dress at breakfast the next day and looked at her for a moment with the same expression he sometimes had at the window in the mornings. That expression she had not yet found a name for, and then said that the color suited her, and went outside to start his day. Mae stood in the kitchen for a moment longer than necessary, her hands around her coffee cup, feeling something warm in her chest that had nothing to do with the coffee or the stove. The trouble came in July, riding in on a Tuesday with the heat shimmering off the road and the dust announcing it a quarter mile out. It was Silas Greer's man Dobbins, the Bay rum lawyer, with 2 men behind him on horses that were better than anything Dobbins himself deserved. Mae saw them from the kitchen window first, and felt her entire body go cold in a way that had nothing to do with the temperature, which was close to 90 degrees. She went out onto the porch before Ira could come in from the corral, because she needed to be between them before Ira could do something based on incomplete information, and she needed a moment to understand what this was. "Miss Brenner," Dobbins said from his horse, using her name with the precise satisfaction of a man who has done his research. "We heard you'd taken a position out here. Mr. Greer thought it worth knowing you were settled." "Mr. Greer has no reason to think about me at all," Mae said. "The judge made his ruling. There's nothing between Mr. Greer and me." "Indeed," Dobbins said, smiling in the way that told her this was not a courtesy call. "However, it has come to Mr. Greer's attention that certain personal property belonging to your father, not the land itself, but items on that land at the time of transfer, may have been removed before the transfer was completed. A handmade chest, some documents, a silver watch." Mae's jaw tightened. "Those were my father's personal belongings. A man's personal belongings don't transfer with the deed to his land." "That depends very much on the terms of the deed agreement," Dobbins said. Behind her, she heard boots on the porch. Ira Stone came and stood beside her, not in front of her, beside her, which she registered with a precision that surprised her. He looked at Dobbins with the flat, undramatic attention he gave to everything, and Dobbins looked back at him with the brief recalculation of a man who has encountered something more substantial than he expected. "This is private property," Ira said. "State your business plainly or move on." Dobbins stated it. Greer wanted the watch and whatever documents Mae had taken from the property. He had a legal position, however thin, and he intended to pursue it. Ira said, "Me." She turned to look at him. He was looking at her with that directness she had come to know, asking her the thing he had made a condition of their arrangement, the truth, plainly. "My father's watch was on his person when he died," she said. "It came to me as his daughter. The documents are the records of his debts and his correspondence and his personal papers, not property records, not anything pertaining to the land. I have them. They're mine." Ira looked at Dobbins. "You've heard her explanation. If Greer has a legitimate legal claim to personal property that does not constitute land or land improvements, he's welcome to pursue it in court. Until a court tells us otherwise, what's on this property is not your concern." It was not the most dramatic speech anyone had ever made in the Wild West. It was not a threat, it was not theatrical, it was not anything other than a very clear and very calm statement of position. But Dobbins looked at him for a long moment and then seemed to measure something and find that the measurement didn't favor him, and he tipped his hat with a courtesy that was nearly mocking and turned his horse around. Mae watched them ride back down the road until the dust covered them. "Thank you," she said. "Will he come back?" Ira said. "I don't know. Greer wanted the land." "He has the land. This feels like cruelty for its own sake." She paused. "Or there's something in those documents he doesn't want anyone to read." Ira looked at her. "Is there?" She had been thinking about that for weeks. She had gone through her father's papers carefully, the letters, the account books, the contracts, and she had found something that she had not told anyone because she did not yet know what to do with it. In among the debt documents was a letter from Greer to her father, written before the loan, that contained language that was not the language of a legitimate lender. It described terms that changed after the fact. Terms that suggested the loan had been designed to fail from the beginning, that the interest rate in the letter was different from the interest rate on the official documents, and if the letter was genuine, then the official documents had been falsified. She told Ira this. He listened without interrupting. When she finished, he was quiet for a long, deliberate moment. "You understand what that means," he said. It was not a question. "It means Greer may have committed fraud," she said. "It means the judge's ruling may have been based on documents that were altered. It means there might be a case. And it means Greer knows you might have evidence he doesn't want surfacing." "Yes," she said. He nodded slowly, looking at the road where the dust was still settling. We need to be careful with this, and we need someone who knows the law better than either of us." He turned to her. "Will you trust me to help you with this?" She looked at him for a long moment. She thought about Theodore Marsh at the bank with his eyes on the window behind her head. She thought about Walt Prout with his apology and his $2. She thought about Reverend Aldous and his patience. She thought about the courthouse door and the bruise on her palm. She thought about Ira Stone, who had asked her for plain dealing and had given it in return, who had stood beside her instead of in front of her on the porch, who had left his door open when every other door in Caldwell had been closed. "Yes," she said, "I trust you." Something passed through his expression at that. Brief, controlled, but she saw it, the way a thing that has been wound very tight moves when some of the tension is released. He nodded once, and that was all, and they went back inside and she put the kettle on, and he spread her father's papers on the kitchen table and they sat across from each other and began to work. The man they needed was in Wichita. His name was Howard Beck, and he was an attorney who had a reputation for pursuing cases that other lawyers declined as unprofitable or inconvenient. He had taken on railroad companies and cattle barons, and at least one county judge who had been quietly funneling land from widows to politically connected buyers, and he had won enough of those cases to make him interesting, and had lost enough of them to make him realistic. Ira wrote to him. A careful, thorough letter. Mae helped him draft it, because she had a precise sense of which details mattered, that laid out the evidence without embellishment. They sent it with a writer going to Wichita, and then they waited, and waiting was its own kind of trial. In the meantime, Greer's lawyer did not come back, but his presence seemed to have established itself as a threat that hung over the ranch without materializing. Clem mentioned, on a Wednesday in late July, that he'd heard talk in Caldwell that someone connected to Greer had been asking around about Stone Ranch, about how many people worked there, about the layout, about whether Ira Stone had a partner or backing. Mae told Ira that evening. He took it with the same measured calm he took most things, but she noticed that he checked the rifle on its pegs before he sat down, and when she got up in the night to get water she found him on the porch in the dark, sitting very still, looking at the road. She brought him a glass of water and sat down on the other chair. The night was warm and full of the sounds of the prairie at rest, insects, wind, the distant movement of cattle. "You should sleep," she said. "I will," he said. He drank the water. "I'm not worried about myself." She understood what he meant, and it did something complex to her chest. She looked at the stars, which were extravagant out here the way they could only be far from town, and she thought about how strange it was that she had ridden to this ranch with a flour sack and a borrowed horse and nothing else, and had somehow ended up here in this chair on this porch, next to this man who was losing sleep over her safety. "Ira," she said. "Me," he said. "Why did you hire me?" she said. "You hired me within an hour of meeting me. Most men would have had more questions. Most men would have been more cautious." He was quiet for a moment, looking at the road. "I had questions," he said. "I have a capacity for reading people that my father told me was either a gift or an affliction, depending on the day. When you sat across that table, I read someone who was telling me the truth. That's actually the rarest thing I know of." A pause. "And you ate that bread and salt pork without pretending you weren't hungry, and something about that honesty decided it for me." She laughed, which surprised her. It came out genuine and unguarded, and she watched it seem to surprise him a little too. "The bread," she said. "There's more information in how a person eats when they're desperate than in anything they say," he said, and there was something almost like humor in it. They sat quietly for a while after that. She was aware of how close they were on the small porch, not inappropriately close, just the proximity of two chairs in a small space, and she was aware of his shoulder near her shoulder and the warmth of it on the night air, and she told herself to stop being aware of it, which did not work with any reliability. "Tell me about Catherine," she said. She was not sure she had the right to ask. She asked anyway because it felt important, because she was tired of navigating around things. He was quiet long enough that she thought he was going to decline, and she was going to respect that decline. Then he said, We married when we were both 20. She was from the same county in Missouri. I'd known her since we were children, which I think is both the best and the worst foundation for a marriage. You have no illusions about each other, and you also have no buffer against loss. He turned the empty water glass in his hands. She was a person of great certainty. She always knew what she thought and what she wanted and what she intended. She never wavered. I admired that enormously. I think I also relied on it more than I should have, because when she was gone I found I had outsourced too much of my certainty to her. He stopped. She waited. I've been working on recovering my own certainty for 3 years, he said. Out here. He looked at the land. I think I've mostly done it. What does it feel like having it back? She said. He turned his head and looked at her in the dark, and she could not see his expression well enough in the starlight, but she could feel the weight of his attention, which was always a specific and tangible thing. Like this, he said quietly. And then he looked back at the road, and they sat in silence until the crickets were very loud, and the moon had moved, and he said good night and went in, and she stayed on the porch a few more minutes breathing carefully. Howard Beck's response arrived in the first week of August. He had reviewed the documents they'd sent copies of, and his opinion was direct. If the letter in Mae's possession was authentic and could be verified as predating the official loan agreement, there was a substantial case for fraud. The altered interest terms alone were significant. He had dealt with Silas Greer's name before, in connection with another land dispute in Sumner County, and he was interested. He would come to Caldwell in 3 weeks. Mae read the letter 3 times. Ira watched her read it and waited. He thinks there's a case, she said. I read it, Ira said. He had read it first before handing it to her. What do you want to do? She set the letter on the table. Outside the kitchen window, the August heat was a visible thing. The air shimmering, the grass going golden, the sky an enormous pale blue that seemed to have pulled away from the earth by the force of the sun. She thought about Silas Greer's expression in that courtroom. She thought about her father's signature on a document that had been designed from the beginning to be something he could never fully pay off. She thought about the oak tree at the edge of the Brenner property with her mother's grave beneath it. I want to fight him, she said. Good, Ira said. He said it simply, without drama, as though it were the natural and correct conclusion that he had been waiting for her to arrive at, and the simplicity of it steadied her more than any amount of reassurance would have. The 3 weeks before Beck arrived were not quiet weeks. Word reached them through Clem, who had ears in Caldwell like an old hound has ears for rabbits, that Greer had hired additional men. Not cowboys, not cattle hands, but the kind of men who got hired when someone wanted a problem addressed in a way that didn't go through courts. Mae slept with her father's knife under her pillow, which she had not told Ira but which she suspected he had inferred from the fact that she did not panic when Clem's news arrived. The men appeared on the road on a Thursday afternoon, 3 of them on good horses, dressed for intimidation in the way that men who are paid to intimidate always are. They stopped at the edge of the ranch property, and one of them called out that he wanted to talk to Ira Stone. Ira went out. Mae was behind him, 10 feet to his right. Clem was at the barn with a shotgun that he was holding casually in a way that communicated he knew how to use it. The man on the front horse, a thick-necked fellow with a red beard and eyes that never quite landed on a single thing, said that Silas Greer was a generous man who preferred to settle things amicably, and that Miss Brenner would be doing herself considerable good if she were to hand over the documents she'd removed from the Brenner property and accept a payment of $50, and then have no further involvement with any legal proceedings. Mae stepped forward. No, she said. Redbeard looked at her with the specific condescension of a man who has never been told no by a woman in circumstances he controlled. He looked at Ira next. Might want to think about that. She answered clearly, Ira said. What she means is no. You can communicate that to Greer. Redbeard's eyes went to Clem and the shotgun, and then swept across the property, doing the math that men like him did 4 people here, 3 of them. He arrived at the same place that Dobbins had arrived at. He adjusted his hat and turned his horse, and the three of them rode away. That evening, Ira moved Mae's room to the front of the house and gave her the room that was closest to where he slept, with no explanation other than that it made practical sense for the arrangement of the house. She did not argue with him, because he was right that it made practical sense, and also because something in her was glad to be closer, which she was not going to examine too directly. Howard Beck arrived on a Friday in late August, on the noon stage from Wichita, with a leather satchel full of papers and the compact, alert energy of a man who found legal battles genuinely interesting. He was in his late 40s, balding, with a sharp face and eyes that moved quickly and landed precisely. He shook Mae's hand first, which she noted. He spent 3 hours with the documents. He asked me questions with the directness of someone who needed accurate information and trusted her to provide it. He went through every letter, every account entry, every piece of correspondence with systematic care. At the end of it, he put everything down and looked at me and said, "This is real. The letter predates the official agreement by 6 weeks, and the terms are materially different. The interest rate in the official agreement is almost double what was agreed in this letter. This is fraud, Miss Brenner. It is also not the first time Greer has done this." "Can we prove it in court?" Ira said. "The letter is our anchor," Beck said. "The question is corroboration. Anyone else who can speak to Greer's practices, anyone who witnessed the original agreement, any pattern of behavior. This is why I mentioned Sumner County. There's another family there who lost land to Greer under circumstances that look very similar. If we can connect the pattern, we have something that a judge cannot easily dismiss." "How long?" Mae said. "Months," Beck said. "These things are slow. I won't pretend otherwise." He looked at her steadily. "But I think we win. I want to be clear that I don't always say that. In this case, I think we win." Something released in Mae's chest. She pressed her hands together under the table to keep them still. "What's the most likely outcome?" Ira said. "Land returned, fraudulent debt voided, possible criminal charges against Greer depending on what else we surface," Beck said. He paused. "You should know that Greer will not be passive during this period. He has resources and he will try to discourage you. It may get unpleasant." "It's already unpleasant," Mae said. "That doesn't change my answer." Beck smiled for the first time since he'd arrived. It was a brief, appreciative smile. "Good," he said. "Then let's build a case." He stayed 3 days at the ranch, working with me on the documentation and writing letters to the family in Sumner County, and to a former land office clerk who had left Greer's orbit under circumstances that Beck found interesting. He slept in the bunkhouse, since that was the only other sleeping space, and Clem complained only moderately and with considerable good humor. On the last evening, while Beck was preparing to leave in the morning, Mae walked out to the corral where Ira was watching the horses in the evening light. He was leaning on the fence in the way he sometimes stood when he was thinking deeply about something that he was going to act on regardless, the decision already made and the thinking just a matter of working out the specifics. "Are you all right?" she asked. He looked at her sideways. "I'm not the one with the most at stake here." "You're the one who brought Greer's men to your door," she said. "You have a ranch to protect. You have Clem and Desmond who depend on you. I brought this here." "You brought it here," he said, "because I invited you here, and I invited you because I wanted to. So the consequences of that are mine to manage as much as yours." She looked at him, the evening light on his face, that steady brown gaze, the lines around his eyes that the sun had written there, and she said something that surprised herself. "I don't know how to repay what you've done." He turned fully toward her, and his expression did something she had not seen before, not the measured calm, not the careful neutrality he wore most of the time, but something more exposed, more unguarded, like a door open that had been shut for a long time. "I don't want repayment," he said. "That's not what this is." "Then what is it?" she said. A long pause. The horses moved in the evening light. The grass bent in the small wind. Somewhere across the prairie a hawk was calling, one long descending note over and over. "I'm not entirely sure how to say this without it being more than you want to hear," he said. He was looking at her carefully, with the same precision he brought to everything he did, not wanting to miss what was real. So I'll say the plain version, which is that I haven't cared this much about a single day in 3 years. I mean the quality of the caring, the presence of it. I notice everything about this place differently since you came. I notice the morning differently. I notice the light. He stopped, and the care with which he was measuring his words was evident. I don't want to ask anything of you that isn't right to ask. You came here because you needed work and you're in the middle of something serious. I don't want to complicate it. Mae looked at him and felt something very clear settle over her. Not the warmth she had been carefully not examining, but something deeper, a recognition. Like finding a word you have been reaching for. Ira, she said. I have been telling myself every morning for 2 months that you are my employer and I am your employee and I should conduct myself accordingly. She paused. I have not been particularly successful at that. He looked at her for a long moment, and then something in him that had been very held let go, and he reached out and took her hand carefully, the way he did everything, with the particular gentleness of a large person who knows their own strength and is deliberate about it, and held it. She looked at their hands. His were calloused and weathered, and her father would have said they were good hands, honest hands, the kind that built things. She turned hers in his and held back, and they stood at the fence as the evening finished itself over the prairie, and the stars began to come out one at a time, and neither of them said anything more because nothing more needed saying right now. The months that followed were hard months, but they were not lonely ones, and that distinction made them endurable. Beck proved to be everything his reputation suggested. He found the family in Sumner County, the Eversons, whose patriarch had died the previous year believing he had lost his land to legitimate debt, and their experience with Greer followed the same pattern as the Brenners, with the kind of precision that was not coincidence. Beck also turned up the former land office clerk, a man named Good who had since relocated to Nebraska, and who, once his own legal protections were arranged, had a great deal to say about Silas Greer's methods with a great deal of supporting detail. Through September and October the legal work proceeded, and the threats from Greer's direction did not escalate into anything more overt than the intimidation already attempted, perhaps because Greer had been made aware that he was now under scrutiny himself, perhaps because Ira Stone's reputation for steady, unspectacular competence had communicated something that the loudly threatening ranchers in the county could not. Mae and Ira navigated the new territory between them with the same quality of careful honesty they had brought to everything else. They did not pretend. They were not demonstrative in front of the hands. That was not Ira's nature, and Mae had her own dignity about it. But in the evenings, in the kitchen or on the porch, they talked the way people talk when they trust each other, which is differently from the way people talk otherwise. Deeper, slower, circling back to things and finding new angles on them. He told her more about Catherine, not in a way that closed her out, but in a way that included her, that said this is part of me and I want you to know it. He told her about growing up in Missouri, his father who was a carpenter and a man of few words from whom he had learned both trades. He told her about the years in between, the things he had tried and abandoned before the ranch, the sense of circling around what he was actually suited for before finally finding it out here in the Kansas grassland. She told him about her father, the whole truth of him, the stubbornness and the tenderness, the way he'd read to her in the evenings from whatever book the library in town had, the way he'd talk to the land like it could hear him, which Mae had believed as a child and did not believe now but found that she still missed. She told him about her mother, gone so early that what she had of her was mostly impression rather than memory warmth, a particular smell of lavender, a voice. She told him about the 12 years of just her and her father on that 40 acres, and how much of herself had been built by that specific solitude. He listened the way he did everything completely, without rushing it, without filling silences with unnecessary words. She fell in love with him the way water moves into a landscape, so gradually that the change is complete before it is visible, and then all at once everywhere. She knew it was complete on a morning in October when she came down to find him already in the kitchen, standing at the stove making breakfast, which was her job and which he had taken over because she had mentioned the previous evening that her back was sore from the laundry. He had not announced this plan. He had simply done it. He was making eggs with the focused attention he brought to every task, and his hair was not yet combed, and there was a gap between understanding and feeling it fully that closed in her chest in that moment and sealed. She sat down at the table and watched him cook breakfast. "You didn't have to do that," she said. "I know," he said. He served the eggs and sat across from her, and they ate in the morning light. And through the window the prairie was doing that thing it did in October, going gold and copper in a way that was extravagant and brief, and then gone. And me thought about all the doors that had been closed, about the bruise on her palm and the flour sack and the $2 and the road to this ranch. And she thought this was what the road had been for. And the thought was so large she had to concentrate on her eggs to keep it from showing too much on her face. The hearing was in November, in a Caldwell courtroom. Judge Harlan Cass, the same judge who had ruled against her in April, was not presiding. Beck had anticipated this conflict of interest and had documented it carefully, and a judge had been brought from Wichita, a man named Fairweather who had no prior connection to Greer and who had the air of someone who found fraud cases professionally satisfying rather than inconvenient. Greer was there with Dobbins and 2 other lawyers. He was a heavy man in his 50s, with the prosperous solidity of someone who had spent years assuming that prosperity was his natural right and had been largely correct. He looked at me when she entered the courtroom with a gaze that was meant to communicate her insignificance, and me looked back at him with the particular steadiness she had developed over 8 months of not being able to afford to flinch, and he was the one who looked away first. Ira was beside her. He had put on his good coat, the dark wool one she had mended twice and which fit him well, and he sat straight in his chair and looked at the proceedings with the same level attention he brought to everything. Beck presented the case with a precision and a controlled passion that me found genuinely beautiful to watch. He laid out the letter. He laid out the timeline. He introduced the testimony of the Everson family and the documented testimony of Good. He presented the arithmetic of the fraud, the difference between what Brenner had agreed to pay and what Greer had claimed he owed, the gap that had made the debt unpayable from the beginning by design. Greer's lawyers were competent, and they were not underprepared. They challenged the letter's authenticity. They questioned the witnesses. Dobbins argued that Good had his own motivations for testimony against Greer, which was true, but not as undermining as Dobbins hoped, because Beck had anticipated it and had documentation of Good's account being corroborated by 2 independent sources. It took 2 days. Me sat in that courtroom for 2 days and did not look away from anything, and Ira sat beside her through all of it, and on the afternoon of the 2nd day, he reached across and took her hand where it rested on her knee, out of sight of the gallery, and held it while Judge Fairweather consulted his notes for the last time and cleared his throat. The ruling was for Mae Brenner. The original debt agreement was declared fraudulent. The transfer of land to Silas Greer was void. The Brenner property was to be returned, the debt itself nullified, and the matter of Greer's potential criminal fraud was referred to the county prosecutor's office for further examination. Me heard it in pieces. She heard the word fraudulent and the word void and the word returned, and they arrived with a delay, like sound from something very far away, each word landing in her in a different place. Beside her, Ira's hand tightened on hers, and that was the thing that made it real. Greer went pale in a very specific way. Dobbins said something to him quietly, and he stood. And the way he stood, the slowness of it, the way the prosperous solidity seemed to compact and contract, told me that he understood what had just happened and what was likely to come next from the prosecutor's office. And she felt something that was not quite triumph but was in the territory of it, something that was also grief for her father who should have been there to hear it and who would never hear it, and she let herself feel all of it. Outside the courthouse, on the steps, Beck shook her hand and told her she had been an excellent witness and a clear thinker throughout, and that he was glad to have had the case. Clem, who had driven them in the wagon, was waiting at the bottom of the steps, and when he heard the result he took off his hat and made a sound of satisfaction that was almost musical. Me stood on the courthouse steps in November light that was thin and cold and clean, and looked at the street of Caldwell, the same street where she had stood in April with a bruise on her palm and nothing at all, and it looked entirely different now. Not because the street had changed, but because she had. Ira came to stand beside her. He did not say anything immediately. He looked at the street with her for a moment. "Well," he said. "Well," she said. "What happens now?" he said. He was asking something larger than the immediate situation, and they both knew it. She turned to look at him. He was looking at her with the clarity of a man who has worked out what he wants and is ready to say so plainly, because that was how he operated. No evasion, no performance, just the truth. "I should go to the property," she said. "There's a great deal to be done. It's been 8 months since anyone managed it." She paused. "But I find that I don't want to simply go and leave this arrangement behind." "The housekeeper arrangement," he said, and there was something in his voice that was careful and also gently teasing. "The whole arrangement," she said. He nodded slowly. "There is a question I have been working up to for some time," he said, "and this seems like the moment to ask it, though the location is not ideal." He looked at the courthouse. "Given that I asked you a question inside this building the last time you were here," she laughed, "the timing of the question matters less than the question." "Me," he said. "I would like to marry you, if that's something you would consider. I'm asking without conditions except the one I've always had: plain dealing. And I should tell you that I'm in love with you, which you have probably understood, but which I want to say directly because you deserve to hear it directly." He was looking at her with the open steadiness that was entirely him, that specific directness that was not performance and not agenda, but simply the genuine expression of a person looking at another person and meaning what they say. She thought of all the things he had done in the months she had known him. The bread and coffee the first morning, the blue cotton fabric, standing beside her on the porch, moving her room, 3 weeks of waiting by correspondence while a case was built. 2 days in a courtroom holding her hand where no one could see. "Yes," she said, "that is absolutely something I would consider." He smiled. It was the kind of smile she had been waiting to see since October, since the morning with the eggs, since the porch in the dark with the stars. The kind that was whole and unguarded, the expression of a man who is genuinely, uncomplicatedly glad. Clem, who had been pretending not to listen from 10 feet away, said, "Well, thank the Lord," and they both turned to look at him, and he shrugged with the unapologetic air of a man who feels his own pleasure in the matter is entirely appropriate. They were married in December, in the small church at the edge of Caldwell, not Reverend Aldis's church, which me could not enter without the memory of his advice about patience, but a Methodist church whose minister was a young man from Ohio named Paulson who was earnest and slightly nervous, and married them with a seriousness that was touching. Me wore a dress she and Bertha Hollies had made together from ivory wool, because Bertha had come to the ranch to offer congratulations after the ruling, and had subsequently become a genuine ally and friend, the kind of friendship that builds quickly, because it is built on mutual respect rather than proximity. Bertha cried at the wedding in a way that she made no effort to conceal, which me found she loved about her. Ira wore the dark wool coat, freshly mended and brushed. He stood at the front of that church and watched me walk toward him with an expression that was so direct and so open that she had to look down at her hands once briefly to keep herself composed. When Reverend Paulson asked if he would take her as his wife, Ira said yes in the same voice he used for everything: plain, clear, without decoration, and it was the plainness of it that was everything. She said yes in the same voice. They went back to the ranch. It was their ranch now, in the way that a thing becomes genuinely shared, not through legal formality, though that was arranged, but through the organic process of two people's lives becoming genuinely intertwined, each necessary to the other's functioning. In January, they drove out together to the Brenner property for the first time since the ruling. The house had been neglected for 8 months and showed it windows needed repair. The kitchen was in disarray. A section of fence had come down. But the structure was sound. Her father had built it to last, and it had lasted. She walked to the edge of the property where the old oak tree stood, the one she had been thinking about since April. The grave was still there, marked with the stone her father had set, still upright, still readable. Mae stood under the tree for a long time without speaking, and Ira stood beside her without speaking, and the January sky was the color of pewter, and the prairie was dry and winter brown, and she felt her father in this ground and her mother in the roots of this tree, and she was back, and it was not what she had lost it as exactly, but it was back. "I think I want to keep both places," she said. "Use this one seasonally. Maybe build it up enough for guests, or eventually for family." "That seems right," Ira said. She looked at the tree and then at him. "My father would have liked you." He looked at the tree for a moment. "That matters to me," he said. She took his arm and they stood there until the cold made standing still impractical, and then they got back in the wagon and drove home to Stone Ranch with the wind behind them. The spring of 1883 came in with an abundance that felt deliberate after the hardships of the year before. Good rains, early warmth, the grass coming up green and thick across the range. Ira bought additional cattle in March, good animals from a reputable operation in Texas that Desmond had connections with through his family, and the herd expanded in a way that justified the new barn he had built the previous autumn. Stone Ranch was prospering, quietly and steadily, in the way of a thing built on sound foundations. Mae discovered she was expecting a child in April. She told Ira at breakfast, the morning after she had been certain enough to trust the information. She sat down across from him with her coffee, and he looked at her face and registered that she had something to tell him before she said it, because he always knew that about her now. She told him plainly because that was the only way she knew how to tell him anything. He was very still for a moment. She watched his face and saw the thing move through it, all of it, the whole complex response, and then settle into something clear and large and undefended. "That's good news," he said, and his voice was not entirely steady. "It is," she said. He reached across the table and put his hand over hers, and she turned hers and held on. Outside the kitchen window the spring was being extravagant with itself. The way spring was in Kansas when it decided to be generous. Everything at once. The light and the new green and the enormous sky. Clem found out by Friday, because Clem always found out things, and was insufferably pleased about it. Desmond was quieter in his response but no less genuine, congratulating me with the careful courtesy that was his particular quality. Bertha Hollies came out on a Sunday with a length of soft flannel and an opinion about everything, and Mae was deeply grateful for her. The pregnancy was not easy. The summer heat was fierce, and Mae was ill more persistently than she would have liked, and there were days in July when the heat and the sickness combined to a pitch that was difficult. But she was not alone in it, and not being alone made it endurable. Ira rearranged his days without making a performance of it, staying closer to the house, taking on what she usually managed without any commentary about the reversal of roles, bringing her water and plain bread when nothing else would stay down. "You don't have to hover," she told him on a particularly bad Thursday in July. "I'm not hovering," he said. "I'm in the kitchen. I work in the kitchen sometimes. You have never once worked in the kitchen voluntarily in the time I have known you." "I have adjusted my practices," he said, with a gravity that was entirely undermined by the fact that he was holding a damp cloth to put on her forehead. She took the cloth and put it on her forehead and looked at the ceiling. "Thank you," she said. "You're welcome," he said. He sat on the edge of the bed beside her. "Is there anything you need that I haven't thought of?" She thought about it. "Tell me something about Missouri," she said. "Tell me something specific. I want something to think about that isn't this heat." he told her about Missouri, about a creek that ran through his father's property, where he and his brother had spent whole summers, the particular color of the water in that creek, the way the trees came down to the banks. He told her about the carpenter shop that smelled of sawdust and linseed oil. He told her about winter there, which was different from winter here, wetter, heavier, the cold coming into your bones differently. He talked until she was asleep. She remembered that later. She remembered it specifically as one of the things she would carry, the careful patience of his voice in the heat of that July afternoon, talking about a creek in Missouri until the world outside the window didn't matter. Their son was born in October of 1883, with Bertha Hollies in attendance and Ira just outside the door, which was where Bertha had directed him with the firm certainty of a woman who had assisted at enough births to have strong opinions about where fathers should be and where they should not. They named him Thomas, after Mae's father. He was a solid, loud, insistently present child from the moment of his arrival, with Ira's dark hair and Mae's way of looking at things directly. And from the first time Ira held him, standing at the window of their room, while the October morning came up over the prairie, Thomas's entire weight contained in his hands with the deliberate care of a man who understood his own strength. Mae felt the thing she had been building toward since April of 1882 arrive at its full completion. Not finality. Completion, the distinction mattering. Silas Greer, in the autumn of 1883, was indicted on 3 counts of fraudulent land conveyance. The Sumner County case had been formally connected to the Brenner case and one other that Beck had uncovered in the interim, and the pattern was undeniable. The trial was in Wichita, and Mae did not attend, because Thomas was 3 weeks old and she had other things to attend to. Beck wrote to her with the outcome in December. Greer was convicted on 2 of the 3 counts and sentenced to 3 years imprisonment and a considerable fine, the proceeds of which, after legal costs, were divided among the affected families. The payment that came to Mae was not large, but it was real, and she used it to repair the Brenner house fully. The Brenner house she and Ira did eventually develop into something useful. By 1885, it was operating as a small way station for travelers and families making their way through that part of Kansas, managed by a couple Ira had hired, the Atkinsons, who were reliable and good-natured, and who kept the place up with a care that Mae found she could actually trust. Thomas was talking by the time he was 18 months old, emphatically, persistently, with opinions about everything in his environment that he communicated in a mixture of complete words and elaborate gestures that Clem found so entertaining that he regularly invented excuses to come near the house. Thomas had a particular affinity for horses that manifested early, and Ira, who had views on horses that bordered on philosophical, took to bringing his son to the corral from the time Thomas could walk steadily, holding him at the fence and talking to him about the animals with the same patient, precise attention he brought to everything. Mae watched this from the porch on 100 different mornings and felt the depth of it quietly and without calling attention to it, the way you hold something precious with care, not grip. Desmond went back to Texas in 1884 to marry a woman he had been corresponding with for 2 years, a fact which he had told no one at the ranch, and which produced a flurry of genuine celebration when he finally announced it before departing. He came back the following spring with his wife, Clara, who was a small, fierce woman from San Antonio who took one look at Stone Ranch and declared it needed more flowers, which she subsequently provided, and who became a warm presence in the community over the years that followed. Clem stayed. Clem showed no particular intention of going anywhere. He developed a grandpaternal affection for Thomas that was slightly embarrassing in its openness and entirely genuine, and when Thomas was 4 and asked Clem why his face had so many lines in it, Clem told him it was because he had smiled so much, and Thomas accepted this completely. Mae's second pregnancy, in 1885, was easier than the first, The summer was cooler, she was stronger, and she knew what to expect in a way that made the knowing itself a form of comfort. Their daughter arrived in February of 1886, small and red-faced and furious about the world in a way that suggested she would have considerable opinions about it as she grew. They named her Ruth, after a woman in the book of Ruth that Mae had read so many times as a child on her father's land, that the pages of that Bible had gone soft at the edges. The night Ruth was born, while Bertha was still there and Thomas was asleep in his room and the ranch was quiet in the February dark, Ira sat beside me in the lamplight with Ruth asleep on his chest, and looked at me in the way he always looked at her, with that particular attention, direct and clear, and said, "I want to tell you something." "Tell me," she said. "The morning you rode down to this house," he said. "You came over that rise on that borrowed horse with that flour sack, and I was splitting wood and I watched you come down, and I thought—" He stopped, choosing the word carefully. "I thought there was something about the way you were riding that was very determined, like someone who had been given a hard road and was taking it anyway." She looked at him. "That's accurate. I didn't know any of the rest of it yet," he said. "I didn't know about the land or the courthouse or any of it. I just saw that." He adjusted his arm carefully around Ruth, who made a small sound and settled. "I just want you to know that I noticed." Mae looked at her husband in the lamplight, holding their daughter in this house that had opened for her when everything else had closed, and she thought about determination and about hard roads and about all the specific, contingent, fragile links in the chain that had brought her here. Bertha Hollies and the notice under the counter, 22 miles of prairie, a borrowed horse, a man splitting wood who turned at the sound of hoofbeats and took his hat off. "I noticed you too," she said. "Standing there with your hat pushed back like that. I thought you looked like someone who knew what he was doing." "I mostly do," he said, with the quiet self-possession that was so characteristic of him and that she still found so consistently reliable. "I know," she said. "That's why I stayed." He smiled at her over Ruth's sleeping head, and outside the window the February stars were the extravagant kind that only appeared in a sky this cold and this clear, and the prairie was silent in the way it was only in deep winter, and inside the house was warm and full of the things that they had built, and the people that they were, and the lives they were in the middle of living. The years that followed were good years. Not uncomplicated. The prairie was never uncomplicated, and life with animals and seasons and the relentless requirements of working land did not simplify with time, but good in the essential sense, in the sense of being genuinely inhabited and genuinely shared. Thomas grew into a serious, curious boy who wanted to understand how everything worked, who took after his grandfather in his practicality and his stubbornness, and took after his father in his directness and his patience, and who had something of me in the way he paid attention to things. The specific, unrushed way of someone who doesn't want to miss what's real. He was 8 years old when he first sat a horse alone, and he managed it with a composure that made Ira stand very still at the fence and breathe, with the controlled emotion of a man who is genuinely proud and genuinely moved, and is determined not to make too large a thing of it. Ruth grew into a child of considerable and vocal opinion, deeply interested in every living creature on the ranch, who told Clem when she was 5 that she was going to be a veterinarian, a word she had heard from the man who came out to tend the horses and which she had installed in herself like a fact. Clem told her he believed her. Mae believed her too. Ira, who had views on horses that bordered on philosophical, began teaching her what he knew, which was considerable from a very early age. In 1888, Mae and Ira rode together to the Brenner property on a clear April morning, April again, the same month it had all begun, 6 years later. The Atkinsons were doing well with the place. The house was in good repair. The oak tree at the edge of the property was in full spring leaf, enormous and permanent in the way that old trees are, the light coming through it in the way that always made me think of the word cathedral, though she had never actually been in one. They stood under it together, the two of them, in the light through those leaves, and Mae put her hand on the bark of it and thought about everyone who was in this ground and everyone who was standing above it, and the long chain of things that connected those two conditions. "Are you all right?" Ira said beside her. "Yes," she said. "I'm very all right." She looked at him. "I was thinking about April 6 years ago, standing outside the courthouse with a bruise on my hand. And this," she said, indicating everything, the tree, the land, herself, him, the bright morning. "I was thinking about the distance between those two things and how it was made, what it was made of." He looked at the tree for a moment. What was it made of? She thought about it genuinely, because that was how she operated. No quick answer, no easy formulation, just the real consideration of the real question. "Bertha Holly's being kind," she said. "A piece of paper under a counter, 22 miles of road, a man who left his door open." She looked at Ira, and he was looking at her with that expression. The one from the porch in the dark with the stars. The one she had been learning for 6 years and had still not entirely finished learning, because it was not a fixed thing but a living one, deepening with time. "And the man who left his door open," she said, "happened to be the right man." He took her hand in both of his. The Kansas spring was enormous around them, the grass green, the sky its particular blue, the prairie doing what it always did, going on, indifferent and beautiful, while human beings inside of it made the specific and precarious choices that defined them. "I was waiting for you," Ira said. He said it simply, without flourish. "I didn't know I was, but I was." She stood beside him under her mother's tree on her father's land in the April light, and held his hands and felt the full, unambiguous weight of her own life. Everything that had been lost, everything that had been found, everything that was still being built, and she was grateful for all of it, including the hard parts, because the hard parts had been the road. They drove home in the late afternoon with the sun behind them, and the ranch coming into view over the last rise, smoke from the kitchen stove rising in the still air, Thomas visible in the corral with one of the horses, Ruth somewhere making noise that carried across the distance with characteristic enthusiasm, Clem on the porch in his chair with his hat over his face in the manner of a man experiencing what he would call a productive rest. It was ordinary. It was entirely ordinary, and it was everything. Mae climbed down from the wagon and went into the house and started the supper, and Ira came in behind her and lit the lamp. And outside the sky went gold and then rose, and then the stars came out one at a time over the Kansas prairie. And the ranch settled into the evening sounds of animals and wind and children being called in from the dark. And the door of the house stood open to the warm night air as it always did in spring, as it would go on doing, open to whatever came next.